We're very lucky to have another great author tonight, and I think you'll really enjoy the book. I've just finished reading it, and it's Powder Days, which you can get at Barrett Bookstore. And it's Powder Days, Ski Bums, Ski Towns, and the Future of Chasing Snow. And it just received a really great review at the Wall Street Journal, I think a week or two ago. And it is definitely a Christmas holiday book giveaway. So run by Barrett's tomorrow and see if you can pick up a copy for your friends. Let me just thank the Friends of the Library for underwriting these programs, because without them, we would not be here. We'd also like to thank Barrett Bookstore, our local independent bookstore, for stocking these books. And we'd like you to type your questions in the Q&A field for afterwards, and we'll be happy to entertain them. Let me tell you a little bit about Heather Hansman. She is a freelance writer and editor. She writes about a range of things, but to generalize, most of what she covers happens outside. She likes the intersection of science, adventure, and culture. She is the environmental columnist for Outside Online, and she writes for places like The Guardian, Sierra, and the New York Times. Heather will start her program tonight with a reading, and then we'll go into some questions and answers and get to know more about her book and about Heather and the beautiful cover. So I'll go away and Heather will take over. All right?
But thanks everyone for being here for tonight, and hopefully we can have a fun conversation about the book. And to start us off, I figured I would just read a little bit from the introduction of the book to give you all a sense of kind of the scene, and also to frame up some of the things that felt important in reporting this book and some of the issues that I looked at. So this is just from the very beginning, and this section is called The Dream. We duck our heads into the wind, ski tips skittering as we curve along the ridge, slowing down to scout the gullies and pick our lines. Katie drops in first, and from above I watch her turn, every arc short but smooth. She sends down a wave of slough as she carves to the chute, more graceful than I'll ever be. In the apron, she stops below a knuckle of rock, out of the line of fire if I were to fall or if the slope were to slide, and weighs me down. I lean forward in my boots and tilt over the edge, giving in to gravity. This rib of rocky chutes was out of bounds when we ski patrolled here at Arapahoe Basin almost a decade ago. Back then, the only way into the steep gullies was to wait for conditions to line up, then duck a rope and sneak around the elbow of the ridge, hoping no one saw you go, hoping that the sugary Colorado snowpack would be stable when you did. I followed older guys past the boundaries, nervous but glad to be invited, hopped up on a mixture of adrenaline, secrets, and the thrill of breaking rules. Now the gullies are inbounds, kicked open by the pressure of resort expansion and skiers hungry for terrain. From the ridge, you can see down to Highway 6, where the real dirtbag skiers used to park their campers, sleeping close to the hill, cutting corners wherever they could. These days, traffic stacks up on the road and you're not allowed to sleep in your vehicle anymore. It feels like all of Denver drives to the mountains every weekend, cramming the slopes, skiing off every bit of snow. It seems sometimes like there are no more secrets. And part of that is true. It has changed. It's more crowded, more expensive, and more exposed. But my frustration is also driven by the shifting baseline of nostalgia and the way the past resonates and echoes when I'm back in a place that used to be mine. And even if things had remained the same, we would be different. Katie has a kid now, and I live 7 states away. We no longer subsist on quesadillas and high life, and we're back here in passing. We're not locals anymore, even when I still try to hold on to those dirtbag secrets and claim them as mine. But we were ski bumps once, or at least we were skiers, chasing the idea of wildness, helixed around an obsession with untouched snow, and the kind of parties where someone often ended up naked. For a while, we were insiders, stratified into the mountain town ecosystem, shiny in our youth and ease, even when we were serving pizza second shift to supplement our skimpy on-mountain paychecks. Even when we were stamping our feet in the bitter cold, scanning lift tickets, while some sweaty second homeowner accused us of ruining his vacation. We were living the dream, prioritizing skiing over everything else. We moved to the mountains and let the other facets of our lives fall into place from there. It was an idea I'd been obsessed with since I was a kid, when I first felt the adrenal glory of downhill motion, lit from behind by the perfect sunset shots of ski movies and glossed up by magazines. I thought that being a skier, a real skier, meant committing to the constant sense of chase. But like any obsession, the reality was more complicated. Even calling yourself a bum signals a level of privilege. And there's an imbalance that comes from chasing something fleeting and selfish because it can all fall apart in one bad fall. Ski towns and the built up fantasy land of resorts can be havens for inequality and abuse. Skiers are drawn to excess, and there's plenty to go around. When I moved to Colorado in 2005, risk was everywhere, but in a way that felt exciting. I liked the brag of drinking too much, and I was too naive to notice harder drugs. Climate change seemed vague and theoretical, and no one I knew had died in the mountains yet. The recession hadn't shaken my generation's idea of stability, and corporate entities were just starting to binge buy resorts. I didn't understand the direct connection between my rampant anxiety and my relentless impermanence, and I thought living in my car was cool. I thought I could exist like that forever. But skiers know that a turn only looks elegant when it's in motion. It breaks down and loses its grace if you stop moving. And ski bumming is sort of the same. It exists in a liminal space, one that seems particularly fragile now, as resorts consolidate, climate change accelerates, and economic inequality underscores existing disparities that concentrate in vacation towns. Personally, politically, and ecologically, skiing is changing. It's hard to live forever in the bubble, and it's particularly hard when it's squeezed by unreal expectations and shrinking spaces. Ski culture glorifies its iconoclasts, but that means as skiers, we've been fed a narrow ideal that's nearly impossible to achieve, which feels like a story about much more than skiing. So that's just a little bit from the introduction, and I think Kathleen and I will jump into questions now.
Okay. Oops, where'd I go? There I am. Hi, everyone. I have a few questions. Let's start off with Heather. For those of our guests tonight who have not had a chance to peruse your book, could you give them a little brief description?
Yeah, absolutely. So the book is about the idea, I think the most kind of like clear top line way to say it is about the idea of ski bums and the idea of being totally obsessed with skiing and kind of pegging your life around that. And I call it kind of the idea of living the dream and then why it's not actually dreamy. So I look at that idea of kind of where the history and culture and stories and myths about being obsessed with skiing come from. And then I kind of look at what that looks like now on the ground and what the tricky parts are about sustaining that and living that lifestyle. And then I kind of get into what that potentially is going to look like in the future in the face of things like climate change.
Yeah,
sort of about obsession and what it looks like in reality.
Yeah, you really cover everything. Why don't you tell the audience a little bit about the origins of skiing in the U.S.?
Yeah. The story, skiing has been tied to kind of westward expansion and economic growth in the U.S. for a long time. It really sort of started in the beginning of last century and even before that with mainly Scandinavian immigrants who came out to the mountains, and skiing was kind of their way to get around. It was transportation in places like Howison Hill at Steamboat. They set up ski jumps, so it kind of became this way to incorporate recreation into kind of cold winter towns. And then in the kind of 20s and 30s, maybe even before that, in places like New Hampshire, more European immigrants had moved to the US and to Southern Canada, and they started setting up ski carnivals as kind of a way for people to get together. They started cutting trails in the mountains. Like I grew up in Massachusetts and skiing in New Hampshire, and there's a bunch of trails on Mount Washington in New Hampshire that were part of kind of those early days of skiing. And the first rope tow in the US went in kind of near where Killington is now, I think in the 20s. And then in the early 30s, the first chairlift in the country went in Sun Valley, which was actually part of the growth of the railroad. It was part of this idea of wanting to get people on the railroad and get people out west. So Sun Valley was kind of the first real resort in the US. And then World War II kind of shut that down for a while. A lot of people were deployed. The kind of, recreation as even something that could be part of people's lives slowed down for a bit. And then after World War II, one of the kind of big booms in skiing was that a lot of veterans, especially from the 10th Mountain Division, which was this unit that was trained to basically do warfare in the mountain on skis, came back from the war, and a lot of them had kind of seen these European ideas of what, ski towns could look like, where skiing was a big part of the culture and transportation. So they came back with that idea and really wanted to, kind of find a way to use that in the US. So they started towns, they started the Aspens and the Vales and a bunch of the kind of bigger, I think, Sugarbush too. They started kind of those resorts that have now become our big deal resorts. And that really kicked off this growth of skiing. Skiing became, I'm gonna get the numbers wrong off the top of my head, but hundreds and hundreds of ski resorts kind of sprung up in the 50s and 60s because of that growth. And spread across kind of all the mountainy, cold areas of the US. And so it kind of kept growing. Skiing grew pretty significantly into the 70s, and then the growth kind of slowed down as we took over a lot of the places where skiing could be possible. So it really is that there kind of was this swell all through the 20th century of skiing.
Yeah. Wow. Let's see. Do you want to talk about who qualifies as a ski bum, and do high-end guides fall into that category?
This is my mother actually very early in the book writing process was like, so who are you talking about here? Who is a ski bum? And I think the way I've framed it up for myself and kind of thought about it is that a ski bum is somebody, there's the kind of this old adage that there's no friends on a powder day. And I think my vision of a ski bum is somebody who will sacrifice everything else for skiing, that in the kind of like hierarchy of needs or things that you might want in your life, like relationships, a job, all these things, that skiing is at the top of the pile, ahead of all those things. So I think you could say that a ski bum has to be somebody who's totally, dirtbagging, doesn't want to get a job, is like just scraping by. But I think, in my mind, I think somebody like a guide or somebody who, has made skiing their job, I think they totally qualify, because I think it is just this like, in the way that you've structured your life, skiing is the center of it all.
Yeah, it's the passion. You express a yearning for the mountains in your book. Now with remote work, is it feasible for you to move back, and where would you go?
Oh, this is actually a very big question in my own life right now. I think that, the growth of, and I'm somebody who, I work for myself, I kind of have worked remotely for a long time, but I think that especially in the past couple of years with COVID and kind of with this growth of flexibility and a lot of people being able to work in a lot of different places, it's really changed the game for a lot of these towns. And It used to be that you had to be, if you were going to live in, Jackson Hole or something like that, you were working at the resort, or you're working at a restaurant, or you're working one of the jobs in town. And the growth of kind of like people being able to work remotely and now kind of being really untethered has really changed kind of the makeup of people in a lot of these towns. So I think that now there is, even from when I kind of moved out and started doing it 15 years ago, the game has really changed. And the perfect place question is a really tricky one for me right now. I'm trying to figure out exactly where that place might be. I spent kind of my ski bum years in Colorado in the Vail Valley, and I still feel very connected to that place and have a lot of friends there. So it might be somewhere in Western Colorado. But one of the things we were talking about a little bit before we started chatting is that winter is changing too, and snowpack is changing, and kind of where is going to be a sustainable place to be a skier.
Yeah.
It feels like it's up in the air right now.
Would you explain a little bit to the audience about the corporate culture that has taken over the ski world?
Yeah. So in the probably since 2006 is kind of when this consolidation started happening. So I was talking earlier about the 10th Mountain Division and kind of all these independently owned resorts that sprung up in the 60s and 70s and 80s. And towards, I'm trying to think, even when I was sort of in high school and college, there were some big American Ski Company, which owned a lot of the resorts in New Hampshire and Vermont and Maine, started kind of these like bigger consolidated groups started buying up ski resorts and managing them collectively. And now there are basically two big groups that own a bunch of resorts. There's Alterra, and then there's Vail Resorts. And they both have these kind of consolidated passes. So if you have Vail's pass is called an Epic Pass. And if you have an Epic Pass, you can ski at any one of Vail's resorts. So they've kind of done this thing where they've bundled resort management, and they're both based kind of outside of Denver. And in some ways that can be good because they have deeper pockets and the ski industry can be sort of a shaky business, but they've also been able to kind of monopolize the ski industry and made it hard for smaller ski resorts to compete. In a lot of places they can kind of set the baseline for lift ticket prices and that kind of thing, and it's harder for other ski areas to, set their prices at a different point and still compete. So they've really, the fact that power is now in kind of the hands of two major ski resort companies has really kind of changed the game of who can be viable in the ski resort business and what places get attention and resources. And that often trickles down into the towns around them and where people can, where there are sustainable jobs for people who want to, be attached to skiing. I think there's a documentary about this that came out just in the past couple of weeks that I was watching the other night. And I think I'm going to get the numbers wrong, but there was something like 1,000 independently owned ski resorts in the 90s, and now there's 400 or something like that. So it's really, the number of ski resorts has really been reduced in part because of that. There's a lot of factors involved in that, but one of the big ones is that consolidation. So it's really changing the face of skiing and where people can ski and what it looks like.
In your book, you mentioned Warren Miller, who I think is the greatest guy ever. He's always such great entertainment. Would you tell people who don't know who he is and maybe where they should go to see some of his films?
Yeah, absolutely. One of the things that was really kind of interesting and fun for me in trying to frame up the story and kind of think about why skiing felt interesting to me and what the background was sort of these movies and magazines and like stories that I'd been told since I was a little kid. And Warren Miller is kind of like the grandfather of American ski movie making. And he's somebody that he actually has a good biography that came out 2 or 3 years ago, somewhat recently, that might be floating around the library somewhere. That's a good read. He grew up in California and skied, from sort of like a working class family, not a lot of money, not a lot of latitude to go skiing. And he fell in love with skiing on a Boy Scout field trip when he was a young kid. And then when he got out of the military, he and his best friend, this guy Ward Baker, kind of had this crummy old car, and they decided that they were gonna move to the mountains and go skiing. And they ended up going on this big road trip around the mountains, and they ended up in Sun Valley. And Warren Miller was sort of like a creative and an artist, and he and Ward lived in their trailer in the parking lot. The guy who managed the base area operations decided that they were kind of like funny and interesting and they could live there. And they were kind of like the original first ski bum dirtbags. They would kind of like, hit on the wealthy woman who came and like get invited to dinner. And they were both, I think, ski instructing a little bit. So they kind of worked the system. And Warren ended up buying a video camera and started filming his friends and, like the famous people were coming skiing. And he started making ski movies. And so the first one, I think he had spent 2 or 3 winters collecting footage, and he ended up showing the first one in California. And there's this great, and he has this really sort of like melodious, deep, classic voice. So he would narrate the ski scenes, and he was funny and would kind of, make fun of himself and make fun of the other skiers. And there's a great quote where he was like, after the first one, I hadn't even started showing the footage yet and people were laughing and I like knew that I had something. So he then every year made a ski movie, and it kind of become, I know for me, those kind of the ski movies that come out in the fall are kind of like the touchstone of this is the beginning of ski season. So you can still go, you know, he passed away a couple years ago, but Warren Miller Entertainment still exists. Yeah. And so they still make a movie every year that kind of gets into this like adventure and ski town culture, and they're funny and they're kind of like travel oriented. So this sort of like narrative of skiing and what skiing looks like, he was one of the first people to really kind of codify that and make it a story.
Yeah, he was great. I don't know if the library has any of the DVDs, but certainly we'll look into it. In your book, you talk about the Peter Pan effect and the role of mental health in ski towns. Let's talk about that a little bit and widen that subject a little bit more.
Yeah. Oh man, there's a lot tangled up in that. I guess to start with this Peter Pan idea, it goes back a little bit to that. You know, Peter Pan is this idea that like you're living in Neverland, you're never growing up, you're never kind of like dealing with real life consequences. You're just kind of floating through life on, you know, having fun and messing around. And I think when we kind of go back to that ski bum archetype and that idea of like just thinking about skiing, there's a way that can easily tip into that Peter Pan thing where it's like you never grow up, you're never saving for retirement or having a house or having a family or having a sustainable relationship. And that is one of the kind of, you know, stereotypes or archetypes of skiers, and it comes from something truthful, because I think in a lot of ways you can get by just doing that in ski towns, and I don't think that's necessarily just, it's definitely not just exclusive to skiing, but I think in a lot of places, in a lot of ski towns, the culture allows for that, where where the focus is often on what you do physically and how adventurous you are. A lot of these towns have pretty significant party scenes and issues with drug and alcohol. But so there's sort of this fine line on, this is one of the tensions in skiing, was one of the things I really wanted to get into in the book. But this kind of, the line between having fun and being dedicated to something that's like beautiful and athletic, and the point where it tips over into something that can be abusive or not healthy or getting in the way of other kinds of development, is a really tricky line to walk. And I think that's one of those things that in a lot of these towns, a lot of people are trying to figure out.
You mentioned the dopamine effect in the ski towns. Would you like to elaborate on that?
Yeah, that's been one of the things I wasn't expecting to get into as much, but I ended up kind of really digging into was, I guess on one level, what makes somebody want to be a skier, and what is it about certain people's brains and their upbringings that would make, that makes it appealing. And one of the things that was really interesting was that there are certain people are more geared for it than others. And there's in the, psychologists have this, 5 major personality traits, and one of them is sensation seeking. And it's basically this idea that certain people, everyone has a set point for needing sensation and needing adrenaline and dopamine. And some people have higher set points for that than others. And I think you see that, you see little kids on the playground. Some of them are, don't want to go on any of the things. And some of them are like throwing their bodies down the slide over and over again. So like we have those inborn set points from a very young age. And then if you are somebody who moves to a ski town and is naturally kind of fired up for that, and then is around it all the time, your set point can get kind of even, there's a nature and a nurture component where it can get kind of even more elevated. And so you're somebody who kind of wants that dopamine anyway, and then you're getting used to it. And I talked to a psychologist in Jackson Hole, or a counselor in Jackson Hole, and the way he explained it to me is that dopamine in your brain is a wanting chemical. So say you have like a really great ski run, feels amazing, you get all these, flushes of chemicals, and instead of feeling satisfied, your brain takes that in and it wants more.
Yeah.
So it's kind of this like cycle where like you're never, it's addiction basically, that like the more you get, the more you want. And that made a lot of sense to me about, myself and a lot of people that I know who are in that world, and
Just
how there's
keep
kind of like constant, you always got to go higher, you always got to go
Right.
harder, you always have to do something more intense.
go farther out of bounds.
Yeah.
Along the same lines, do you think the ski bum myth encourages negative behavior? And talk about the characteristics of a risk taker in the ski world, and also speak about the positives of skiing.
Yeah. I think we, in skiing and just kind of culturally, we often glorify risk takers.
Yeah.
And we are excited about people who can go further, faster, or do something braver. So I think there is this kind of like cultural component to that. And then I think a lot of times in the world of skiing, in ski towns, your cultural currency is based on that, where like people know you or respect you or know who you are because you're the person who went and skied XYZ line. So I think that can, in a lot of ways, that's great and exciting and cool, but I think it also can feed these kind of negative habits, negative feedback loops, where it's hard to, when your sense of self and your sense of community is tied to what your body can do and what you have done, I think it can be really hard to, unattach yourself from that and ever feel like you can step back and not be pushing it all the time. So I think it's a really, again, it's like a lot of these tensions are really interesting because they're really tricky, and there's not like one right answer or not one point where it becomes excessive or abusive.
Yeah. And some people end up in the Olympics and some people don't.
Yeah. And like we glorify those people who are in the Olympics. Like I thought a lot about Simone Biles in writing this, where it's like you're the person who's the best at the thing that you do and you're going so hard, but then when you want to step back for a second, all of a sudden people are jumping on your back.
Yeah. Let me think what else.
I don't think I answered the rest of your question.
Say,
I don't think I answered the second half of your question. I have to.
You did answer the first part, and the second part was about the positives of skiing.
Oh yeah, there are so many things that are positive in that. That same kind of feedback loop can be, we spend, the rest of us are often people who aren't in those worlds. We spend so much time sitting in front of our computers that like to have a reason to be physically outside and engaged with the world around you is such a hard thing to come by right now, I think. And it's incredibly valuable. And then there's also a really big community aspect to it too. And that skiing kind of like, I was reading a book recently about, it's called The Power of Ritual. And it's about sort of how we as a community have become, less religious, and people are often looking for points of community or places where they can connect and kind of have those, circles where with people they wouldn't necessarily interact with otherwise. And one of the things that the author gets into is sports, and how sports can kind of be this way for people that you wouldn't necessarily be connected to otherwise, can come together. So I think that, and I know for me that's been a really big factor in my life, that skiing has kind of led me to my best friends and my partner and kind of all these, community value and my job and all these things.
Yeah. Let's see, in your book, you do discuss the difficulties service people have in ski towns finding housing and affordable housing. Which towns do you think is doing the best to remedy this problem?
Ooh, who's doing the best? I think there's a lot of housing, especially, sort of feels like it's become this really, really hot button issue in terms of being kind of a benchmark for livability in a lot of these towns, and a way for people who might be, ski patrollers or lift operators or ski shop managers. A lot of these people, and this has become even more amplified in COVID, as people from outside are moving in, but a lot of these people are struggling to even be able to find a place to live
Yeah.
in a lot of these towns. There's actually Aspen yesterday or the day before just put a citywide moratorium on second home on Airbnb in short-term rentals and on new development while they kind of try and figure out what they're going to do about the housing crisis because they don't have anyone to work.
Yeah.
And there's a lot of different tactics and solutions and things that people are trying. Aspen was actually really the chunk about housing and income inequality in the book is based in Aspen. And Aspen was really out ahead of the game in terms of employee housing and deed restricted housing and affordable housing and trying to build in workforce housing I think they started in the 80s. And now most ski towns have a program like that, but they were kind of the first ones. But I don't know of a town that is really kind of on top of it. There's some places that have tried to figure out tax credits to, when like say a new hotel goes up, they have a certain amount of tax credits that goes into, employee housing. There's some places that have gotten really into public transportation and trying to kind of expand this to the bubble for where workers can live. But I think it's a really thorny question.
Yeah.
That gets into kind of all these values of, how do you compensate workers? How do you make your town inclusive? What public services can you bring in? So it's really, that's in looking at kind of the future of skiing in ski towns. I feel like that's really one of the big nut questions.
One of the pivotal pieces. Along with that conversation, you mentioned deed restriction housing. Would you explain that to the audience?
Yeah, that's basically housing that oftentimes the city will provide or buy initially. And basically it is for people who work in the community, whether that's teachers or healthcare workers or, people who work for the ski resort. And it is more affordable than free market housing. And then the amount that it can appreciate year over year is a cap. So say you get into it, you might get a better deal on a house that you can afford, but it's not going to grow.
Right.
It's not necessarily going to be, like a huge asset, but it's often kind of set up as a way to get people, get workforce housing set up and, get people kind of a leg up to live in the communities where they work.
Yeah. Let's see. Okay, we're going to talk a little bit about global warming. Skiing is one of the most carbon intensive outdoor sports. Is it sustainable? And give your audience some examples of what global warming is doing to the ski world, both in the United States and internationally.
Yeah, I mean, I think we were talking before we started about this winter, and I'm in Washington State, and we had one big snowfall, and then we got a huge rain event, and there basically hasn't been any snow yet this year. And I know Colorado struggled, Utah struggled. We were talking about the World Cup race at Beaver Creek week before last or last week, and how they only could open one run for that race.
Yeah.
And, global warming is directly related to precipitation, what falls where, what the temperatures are. And, the temperature differential or the temperature range where you can make snow is fairly small. And a lot of places, I mean, I think about, the places in New Hampshire that I grew up skiing as a kid. A lot of those places are kind of on this threshold where they might not be below freezing much in the winter or at all. There was a paper that just came out last week or 2 weeks ago in Nature, kind of a scientific paper that said by 2050, there probably won't be much of a snowpack in the Sierra. And by the end of the century, a lot of places that are really snowy now could potentially not have any snow. So oh, go ahead.
Do you know how Europe and internationally the snow is doing this season?
I think Europe's actually having a really good season, but they've
good.
had, in the past couple of years, it's been pretty touch and go. So it is, and that's one of the tricky things in talking about climate change or writing about it or trying to kind of wrap your hands around it is that it's not linear and it's not consistent, and you can't predict. You know, you can't say in 2025 it'll be good here and it'll be bad here.
Right.
So it's sort of like you have to look at the breadth of it. But yeah, but I think like we talk about all these other things that are tied up in skiing, but if there's no snow, if there's no winter,
there's no skiing.
Matters. Yeah.
Do you think ski areas are built to pivot?
I think they're trying. Yeah, I think in a lot of places, there's been some laws passed that have allowed more summer recreation at ski areas, especially on those ski areas that operate on Forest Service lands. You see a lot of places building bike trails in the summer or hiking trails. So I think in the long run, a lot of these places are kind of thinking about that and what it might look like. And I think I talked to a meteorologist for the book who's he's a snow forecaster. He's really dorked out on kind of the future of snow. And one of the things that he told me that has really stuck with me is that there's going to be some places that lose out, that, you know, are really right on that margin. And then there's going to be some places that will probably do better, at least for a while, as, you know, the places that are kind of high up and cold and have deeper pockets so they can build in snowmaking infrastructure, things like that. So it's not going to be like in 5 years, the whole thing disappears. It's going to be this kind of touch and go thing.
This kind of goes with when we were talking about mental health and ski towns. You mentioned in your book that high altitude might actually be at the root of some mental illnesses. Could you explain that?
Yeah, there's a guy in Utah. He's at University of Utah, whose name's Perry Renshaw. He actually used to be maybe a Mass General. He was in the Boston area for a while. And he has studied the impacts of altitude on depression. And it was sort of like, it started with this anecdotal research where he had kind of heard that, you know, people who had moved to Utah or Denver, you know, high places, had increasing anxiety or depression. And he kind of walked it back and looked at how basically oxygen deprivation impacts your dopamine receptors. And it's sort of this idea that if you're getting less oxygen, for some people, you're not getting the same dopamine and serotonin, and like your brain receptors don't. I mean, I'm totally oversimplifying the science, but that your brain basically can't pick up as many of the chemicals that make you happy.
Interesting.
It's not true for everybody, and it's not true across the board, but they've done sort of these, you know, studies on rats and other animals, and then they've kind of like applied it to people. And so it's very early days of research, but it is this, you know, when you talk about mental health, there are these sort of like, you know, internal factors and social factors and environmental factors that impact all of us.
That's interesting. This is talking about COVID a little bit. What do you think the past year with COVID has done to the ski industry? Have any mountains closed that you know about?
I don't know of anywhere that's closed. I know there was a big scramble in the end of that season in 2020 and then going into last year about if ski areas would be able to open, if they were going to be able to get workers, like what that was going to look like. And in a lot of places, I mean, there's been this real surge in interest in outdoor activity and recreation across the board in COVID in ways that are really positive. I think a lot of people are getting outside more, but it's also put a lot of pressure on outdoor recreation and ski resort infrastructure and that kind of thing. So in some ways, I think the pandemic has upped the interest in this kind of thing. But it's also made it, I was talking to some friends who are ski patrollers recently, they were saying that, you know, if you're patrolling and you're potentially going to have to give CPR to somebody or something like that, COVID totally changes the game. Or if anytime you're going to have to, you know, like be on scene, you don't know what that person's history is like. So I think it got more people outside, but it also put a lot of pressure on the people in the kind of frontline worker jobs and service jobs. And also just trying to like, I think like everybody was doing in COVID, it's a moving target for what's safe and what's acceptable and how open you can be and, you know, who, you know, like how how you move the flow of people through any kind of business. And then to go back to one of the things that we were talking about earlier, a lot of people, like I know several people who moved to the mountains because their job suddenly became remote or they weren't going to have to go into the office anymore. So I think that the demographics have also changed a lot of people who have access to skiing and who are there.
Let's see, you see skiing as a link to nature. Is this slant strong enough to help create a public that understands the environmental impact this sport places on our planet? I have noticed that POW, Protect Our Winters, advocates for climate policy. What can the general public do to help?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think one of my sort of big outdoor mentors was this guy, George Wendt, who was one of the first raft guides in the country. He has this philosophy or this kind of like idea about conservation and getting people outside. And his thing is that we say what we love and we love what we know. And so I think it's really, you know, one of the values of any kind of outdoor recreation being outside is that it does give you a personal stake in what's happening to the world and what's happening in the environment. And I think that that's, I know for me, that's been really crucial in kind of like my personal ethic about caring about the environment and the world. But I think that that's just one piece of the puzzle. And then I think caring about it is just kind of one step. And that to actually do something about it is a whole nother level of engagement that doesn't, you know, just because you went skiing and you love it doesn't mean you're doing anything. And so I think POWs are really, if people want to kind of, especially kind of dig into that climate policy, POWs are really good starting point. They're very clear about what, you know, their baseline is. That's a acronym for Protect Our Winters. And their big thing is that they're looking at kind of like the population of people who care about being outside, and then also the jobs that come out of that, the economies, the kind of everything that's attached to that, and then advocating for policy, whether that's energy policy, whether that's public land use, they kind of advocate for that. And I think that's a really crucial starting point in kind of like that conversation of like, okay, how do we protect the things that we love, and what can we as individual citizens do to kind of hold on to those things?
I agree. Do you have a spiritual link to the mountains?
I've been thinking about that a lot. I'm not somebody who really considers myself spiritual. I'm not somebody who comes from like much of a religious tradition, but I do know that, and this is where it gets a little like hokey and woo-woo, and I don't know if I have the right words for it, but I do feel like there's a reason that I can't totally explain why being in the mountains feels really important to me. And I think a lot of people feel similarly, and that I feel more like myself, or whatever the right word might be, when I'm kind of outside moving around. There's a really Dolores LaChapelle, who was a sort of a, maybe guru is the right word. She's sort of a scientist. She's sort of a philosopher. She has a really wonderful book called Deep Powder Snow that's out of print. It's really hard to get your hands on, but she kind of has this ethic about why skiing is important and why this kind of like flying, no gravity, freedom feeling is like important for our brains and our bodies. So yeah, I think I don't know exactly what to call it, but I think there is something there.
Yeah. Let's see. We're coming to the end of our questions, and let's see, this one, you received a nice review from the Wall Street Journal. Are you hoping this book does more than just answer the question, do you think there are any more ski bumps?
Yeah. And it's been, I mean, one of the most interesting and the coolest things about putting a book out into the world is that you don't really know, you know, like you make this thing and then you send it out and you never know what it's going to hit for people or how people are going to respond to it. And it has been really, really gratifying and really special for me to kind of see the questions that come up for people out of this. And I think that, you know, for me, in thinking about, this could have been a book that was just like the history of skiing, and it felt really important to me instead to kind of dig into these bigger issues that impact skiing and kind of use skiing as a lens for, you know, a way to look at housing or, you know, climate change or whatever the case might be. And these things that felt like they were really present and vivid in these places that I love and that where people I love still live and they're grappling with it. So yeah, so I'm hoping that it starts these conversations and kind of gets the ball rolling about thinking about what the future is going to look like and how we, like why we need to be outside and why that joy or spirituality or whatever we want to call it is important. And then also like, what do we do to protect that?
Yeah, I think your book does all those things. It's not just a ski book. It's a book about the relevancy of skiing today and yesterday and what's to come. And I think you really covered all those areas. So as we get closer to the end of our time together, what is your favorite place to ski?
Oh, that's such a hard question because it depends on who you're with. I really love Crested Butte. I really love Silverton. Bridger Bowl in Montana. I love Mad River Glen. My
The
parents
list gets longer.
The list, I know it's like a total. There's so many factors. Yeah. So I have, which is like everyone's a little different too. So I think there's something to be said for that.
Talk about Mad River Glen a little bit.
Oh, Mad River Glen is in. So I grew up spending a lot of time in Sugarbush, New Hampshire. My dad worked at the airport there when I was a kid. And Mad River Glen is a mountain there that's owned by a co-op. So it's always been independent. It's always been owned by the skiers. And they've got this classic single chair that takes like 12 minutes or something like that to crank up the mountain. They don't groom most of the mountain. So the terrain's all kind of like gnarly and intense. And it kind of, I think for me, especially growing up, it was this real like, if you could ski there, you were hardcore. Like that when I was a kid, it was like, okay, this is cool.
And when did you start skiing?
I started skiing, I don't know exactly. I was probably 4 or 5. I know I was skiing by the time I was 7 because I fell and broke my thumb when I was skiing with my father, and my mother was like furious about it. That's one of my kind of first skiing memories, is being in the clinic and my mom just chewing out my dad for taking me down a black diamond. So yeah, so I was pretty young, and which is a total, I'm so in awe of people who learn how to ski as adults because it just seems so hard because you're from the ground.
Better as a 5-year-old.
Yeah, I remember the traumatic parts.
Here's a question that you get. I think we all ask lots of authors all the time. It said, what would you tell your younger self?
Oh, so many things. I think, a lot of the basis for the book is my personal, it's first person, it's my journey through skiing. And I spent a lot of time, I moved to Beaver Creek when I was 21 with 2 of my college friends. And I was reading back through my journals and stuff from that time. And I was so sort of like anxious and worried if I was doing the right thing and overthinking everything. And I think I would try and tell myself to like be in the moment a little more and not be so worried about what comes next, or if people liked me, or if I was a good enough skier, and just kind of like to be in the moment.
That's an answer we get so often from authors when I ask that question, and many of them say, just be confident, believe in yourself, because as a young person, that's not always so easy.
No, not at all.
And most of these young people that I've interviewed are so talented, it's unbelievable. And you're thinking, how come you didn't think you were the best? But it's just, I guess, an age issue.
Yeah. And I think that maybe lets you want to ask the questions and pay attention. And
yeah,
I don't know.
Well, we have a question coming in from the audience from Mary. Would your book be acceptable for a 14-year-old skier, or is there a glorification in some ways of the ski bum life that might skew her view?
I think it depends on the person. Yeah, I think I do talk about alcohol abuse. I do talk about suicide. Yeah. There are some hard topics in it, but I think it depends. I don't think there's anything in it that would make her riskier, or I think it's sort of a matter of that person's maturity level and what they were up for for opening,
Yeah.
like having a conversation about.
This is more of a statement from Dirk. Why would you ski when you can ride a snowboard? Ha ha, just joking. More seriously, why do you think we're not developing new ski areas given that demand clearly outstrips supply? And is that true? Does demand outstrip supply?
Demand has been, so the skier numbers have been consistent. Basically, the National Ski Areas Association does the numbers on this stuff, and numbers have been fairly consistent over the past 20 years, 25 years. So I think, although ski resorts are closing, so there is a supply and demand issue, but I think more than that, it's hard to find a good place to operate a ski area. You need the right kind of terrain, you need snow, you need access, and then you also need it needs to be available land. And so there needs to be, depending, a lot of Western ski resorts are on public lands, so that would take permitting, and that would open up these spaces. I know I end the book in Silverton, Colorado, which is kind of one of the last. They opened 15 years ago. I don't remember the date kind of off the top of my head, but they're one of the most recent ski areas to open, and they spent Jen and Aaron Braille, who are the couple who started it, had been in Montana. They were kind of looking all over for places that they could open a ski resort, and it took them almost 10 years to find a place, and then it took them 5 more years to get the permits figured out and to get the community on board and to talk to the Forest Service. So I think there's a lot of factors at play in terms of geographic area, places that are going to get good snow. Like those guys, the 10th Mountain guys did a really good job of kind of snapping up the good spots. So now it's kind of a matter of figuring out, are there places where you could kind of jam somewhere in that also has access, also has, a community that could support it.
Is there anything I forgot to ask you about your book that you want to mention?
I don't know. I think we covered a lot of ground. I'm excited to see what the conversations open up about it. And I think oftentimes in talking about it, it's easy to talk about the downsides and the stuff that feels hard and scary in the future. And I don't want to lose the good parts too.
Yeah.
And the kind of, like the reason why. I mean, one of the big questions for me in this was like, why has this thing become such a driving factor in my life? And why have I been obsessed with skiing for so long?
Yeah.
Even though it is expensive and selfish and carbon intensive. And I think there is this kind of like joy and fun that it's really hard to get almost anywhere else.
Yeah. I think you're not alone in those feelings. So let me just remind everyone, Barrett Bookstore has the book on their shelves. It will make a great holiday gift. Let me show you the cover again because it's really great. Powder Days, Ski Bums, Ski Towns, and the Future of Chasing Snow. Pick it up. It will make for great reading over your holiday vacation. And I want to thank Heather so much for joining us from Seattle tonight. I love the book, and I hope you do really well with it and have a great book tour. And thank you for joining Darien, Connecticut tonight.
Thanks, everyone. Thanks for being here.
All right. Good night, everyone. We'll see you next week. Thanks, Heather.
Thank you.